Amen. I don't have any teaching, but I do have, there's something that's more of a, may seem redundant in some ways, of just the impression that the only reason I mention it is because sometimes when you speak about things, you can sense when there's an influence from the realm of the spirit around what you're saying. Not because you think it's spiritual. Sometimes you just begin to speak about something and you're kind of taken into that realm just by what it's being shared or spoken. And there was a couple of things in the last week or so that, and even within the last couple of days, that came to my mind and took me into that place. And I'm not promoting a spiritual experience or, anything like that. It's more not even a testimony so much, but it is a reality. One thing that's every year that really weighs on me, not as a burden, but just as a sobering reality, is the timing of God and being able for his people, as his sons, to come in line with God's timing. And I'm not talking about just the fulfillment of certain things, but the way that God fulfills, the way that his times come to be. It's obviously not directly correlated, although it is directly fulfilled in the linear timeline of man's existence. But that doesn't really speak to how God fulfills. God is not bound by time. These are things that we've mentioned here and there and time and again throughout the last 15 plus years, and really pointing to something beyond what we understand and how we understand and engage with time in particular. There's a physiological reality to the rising and the setting of the sun and to the natural laws of the universe and the created order. But there's another order. There are other laws that supersede natural laws. And my point here is not to talk about miracles and, signs and wonders related to God's, being beyond the natural order. We can see those things exemplified in Jesus' life. There are testimonies of things like that from the prophets, from the time of Joshua, to Isaiah, where in essence time stood still. Yet, it's not that people were standing still. There's also some scriptures that Paul talks about. I don't know why I got off on time. Actually, I had no intention for that. But he says that that God is able and that we should seek to redeem the time. This ties in the idea of what was lost in a sense. Other scriptures then that are correlated to that are that the Lord will restore what the enemy has robbed. And, all the while we have the pressing nature of the tyranny of the urgent in the fleshly life, in the fleeting nature of life. Solomon spent a lot of time writing about the fleeting nature of our life, how short it is, and thereby how senseless or pointless it may seem. It's fleeting. It just comes and goes. And then we see the physical realities that in our own bodies. One thing that this is a bit of a sensitive subject in terms of just the social taboo nature of it. But, when my parents visited last time they were here, looking upon their bodies as they have aged was a startling reality of time. And, in my heart, my concern was not, my parents are old and nearing their last days or anything like that. But that since the time we left and moved from Austin, and, I was thinking about how quickly time has passed. The ages of my children, their level of knowledge of the world, the events of the world, we're talking about a near 20-year time span. Rachel and I just celebrated our 21st anniversary, and while we were away, I watched some documentary series on some of the timeline of events that has happened since the time of 9/11 back in 2001.
That's right, 20 years ago. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's been 20 years, and when you consolidate the governmental and global infrastructure and government movements over the last 20 years, it's really incredible how tied together they are to this singular event. Now, yes, there were some things that, political wise and otherwise, that existed prior to that, but that really defined certain things for the entire world. And global relations and economics and everything else. So I digress a little bit. But at the same time, may that give some context to my thoughts here. When I think about God's time, and this has been particularly true in relation to our observance of the feasts and the calendar of the Lord in the last 3 to 5 years. And really also our directed efforts to release ourselves and move away from the timeline or the way of life and timeline that man honors. So that doesn't have to be related to a particular culture or holidays, and yes, the Western culture has its own set of events, New Year's, timelines, holidays, things like that. And a significant portion of Western life as a culture it's designed to be lined up with an expectation and fulfillment of those times. In essence, one thing that I'm getting at is that our commitment to or allegiance to patterns like that, because in this sense, time is a pattern. It's a cycle. And even as it was well known within the ancients of former generations, the pagan antiquities, it was very well known that the alignments within time were also considered to be doors that open and close spiritually. So it's not necessarily a new concept at all. The same was true in relation to, the timeline or the calendar that God gave his people. There was a wrapping up and a beginning, and a time of harvest and a time of sowing, time of reaping. There was a cycle there, each representing a particular flow of life. So in comparison, the way that man has, and I think it became more recently formally known, under the Roman Empire, as the Gregorian calendar, but that was not anything new. I think it was more formalized at that point, but it was something that had always been practiced. ritually. And, as we have maintained that flow of time for global events and timings and calendaring and counting of days, it becomes, and then to look back at how the Lord designed his calendar, which was still with days, months, and years, but the appointments of time and the determination of time were very, very different. They were open-ended in a sense, which seems impossible for counting time. Time, by its essence, is very exact, and the more technologically advanced that we become, the more exact our understanding of timing is. We come down to more recent inventions like the atomic clock, which is supposed to be able to keep time nearly perfectly. We've come to certain things where we recognize the differentiation between days and seasons down to the moment. We can in this day look ahead as far as our applications will allow us to 10, 20 days ahead and see exactly the moments of daylight we will have, almost down to the second, the moments of darkness that we will experience on any given day of the year. And so these things that were, again, very well understood by the ancients as well, the winter solstice, the summer solstice, the peaks and the highs and the lows. When I began to compare the two ways of measuring time, and again, this is not new information to you guys, but I always find it fascinating and meaningful. God's time, again, there are some similarities, but the understanding or the pinpointing of God's time always comes through observation, not through prediction. That is a real marker between the wisdom of man and the ways of man in the world, even in their highest noble sense and technological advancement. Man seeks to look at time in such a way so as to be able to control it. And much of this really comes down to that governance of our life. Time is a governance. Even the heavenly vessels that enable us to have some understanding of times, dates, and seasons originally given as objects to enable this kind of observation. But again, they're done in such a way so as to be predictive from man's timeline. And with God, and we see this very clearly especially at the beginning of the year, because of the new moon. It's not basically the festival of the Feast of Trumpets begins at a time when it's most difficult to see the moon, but it cannot begin until it's observed, and that's very interesting. And then there was a very particular order that was given by God. And to enable a way to understand the time of God, not just the time of day. Okay. And that order was fully contained and practiced in within the household of God, within the context of the priesthood and the order of the priesthood. There were those in the midst of God's people who were designated by God, appointed by God to bring that kind of truth and revelation to the people of God. This is God's time. So, and this even somewhat predated not predated in a sense, but was also exemplified in the way that Israel moved in the wilderness. it was according to, they would not choose the time or the place where they would go. It was under the sole discretion and leading of God, who was leading them by the pillar, the cloud during the day and the pillar of fire by night. So they literally, God was instilling in his people the concept and a reality, really, of keeping their eyes fixed on him. That's how they would know what to do and when to do it. And every feast is that way. Every feast comes by observation, not by prediction. Now, we live in a different age at this point because of technology. We can actually look ahead at those things. I think that has caused some callousness and numbness in the eyes and the hearts of God's people, because we have fallen into the predictive mentality. And you can see how much this has even affected contemporary Christian understanding of the last days, because it's all become predictive. It's all become looking ahead to try to make a way for yourself, really. And that's the one of the reasons that man wants to control time is because he wants to protect and provide for himself. It's very inwardly focused. It's very selfishly focused. And one of the things that God did was put his people in such a position that would not be the way they would think. We see this in the teaching of the apostles as well, when they say things like, consider others before yourself. They're looking outwardly. They're considering you are not the center of the universe, your life. There's something greater than you that is wrapped up in the purpose of God, and it is in the context of all his people. And so I began to see that time not as time in the way that we think it, but as a different flow of life. There's a rhythm, there's a flow. When we enter into it, we literally can't miss any moment that we're appointed for.
Yeah.
You see, so we don't need to be in the mindset of prediction for self-preservation. But we need to be found in the position of the now and never miss any appointment that is ahead, because we are currently in the right position, timing, alignment with the Lord and his purpose. And that's huge, because the real admonitions that came from Jesus to the Pharisees, to the religious leaders, who were set aside and appointed to be those who could see ahead. And he spoke to them very directly about this. On one occasion he said, you know the days and the seasons. You can tell me when the harvest has come, and when there's a red sun and it means this, all what that means, but you have no idea the day you live in. In another place he said, you missed your day, the day of visitation. The thing that you think you had fully calculated, you actually missed. And that's because of the nature of understanding and becoming or aligning with God's time. So, when I hear other believers talk about, whatever the numerology stuff is in scripture and times and cycles. And when they go on to the predictive path, what they are doing in their own hearts and minds is imagining they can force God to do something, and therefore plan their lives by it. God has to do something at this point because these are his time cycles. We've figured them out. We've broken the code. So now God's wedged in and he has to fulfill. Well, even if that timing was correct, and we don't understand the ways of God, we will miss the fulfillment of his purpose. Let me give you an example. pretty obvious example. All Israel was abuzz, alight, lit with a flaming fire during the time of Jesus. Everyone knew it was the day of the Messiah. It was in the people's hearts. It was in the prophets' hearts. It was in alignment with the scriptural fulfillment of Daniel's timing. Everything was there. But it was missed. How is that even possible? Because they didn't know the heart of the Father or the ways of the Father. So there must be another way of understanding God's timing and aligning with it. Because to be improperly aligned with the time, even if we're able to mark something on a calendar, can still put us in a position to miss God's purpose. And it is the fulfillment of God's purpose that is the only thing that will bring fulfillment to our own destiny as God's sons. So how long then has God called his people? We hear the words out of the world, out of Babylon, the world system, out of this way of engaging with life, with people, various relationships, business, all the engagements of life. What's interesting is God never separated his people from the mundane, regular responsibilities of life. But he gave them a way to practice them. He gave them a priority in which they should be plotted out. And then he said, enter into my flow of life. In this sense, you will fulfill everything that I have designed. It brought to mind, I was sharing, a similar subject with Justin yesterday. We were talking for a while, and it reminded me of the illustration of the river, which I think Emmanuel, if I remember correctly, had shared at some point years ago. If there is this beautiful river that exists in a far away, hidden valley, it is of unprecedented purity, beauty, everything that you would imagine a beautiful river to be, isolated from the outside world in many ways. To most, there is no knowledge or even an imagination that such a river exists. And people happily go on with their lives not knowing about this beautiful river. However, there floats around from time to time an imagination or a testimony from one or the other that such a river exists. And they are able, in that light, then to share what they know about the river. It brings inspiration to many. It allows the imagination to open and to think, wow, I didn't know that such a thing existed. It may bring a smile to the heart and a comfort to the soul. Yet, they have never been there. They've never seen it. They don't know really, they only know that it exists. And many people are happy simply to know that it exists. There's a better place. There's a beautiful place. But in the hearts of some, they would seek it out. Maybe they would come to the precipice of that valley, looking down below at the beautiful vegetation, and be able to see the sunlight glitter off the river below. And in their heart be so fulfilled and And in their excitement, they run from the place to go tell others all that they have seen.
Mm.
And again, people are inspired, joy. Maybe many others come to the precipice of this valley to see its beauty.
Mm.
And they too can testify, wow, this is a beautiful place. It really does exist. Let me go convince others that this is not an imagination, that it's really there.
Mm.
You know, it's real. I proved it. I've seen it.
Mm.
Yet there are others who venture down into the valley. There are so many stages to this. You could go on endlessly, but let's say there are some who come to the water's edge. Beautiful sound of the rushing water over the rocks. They can see the twists and the turns and the life that exists there. They can smell the moisture in the air. They realize that this position at the river's edge was so much more fulfilling and life-giving than up high above above the valley. It's like another world, completely different place. Again, some may be so filled with joy and fulfillment at this point and a desire that others know, that others experience what they've experienced, that they run again to claim others for this experience. Others still may remain and venture in, maybe first to touch with the hand, to take out a portion of water and drink its coolness, to have a better understanding of the purity of what flows there, the good taste. Maybe they put their feet in the water. Maybe others still immerse themselves and are cleansed by the river. Each one maybe going back to draw others to experience what they experienced, to see what they have seen, to hear what they hear, taste what they taste, touch what they touch. Those are all wonderful, beautiful experiences. Fulfilling in a certain measure each one. But what is it they fulfill? Really, the pinnacle of their own desire, their own understanding. Because there is yet another, if we were to compare each one of these with maybe the knowledge of God, the knowledge of God's purpose, maybe some never knew it. Maybe some come to a high level view of it. Maybe some have some very unique experience with it. But Jesus himself said, if you enter into this life, in essence, you will become the river itself. You see, all the experiences prior are not equal to being brought into the flow of the river. Only once you have even submerged your body into the river are you able to imagine its life force and flow. Interestingly, it is a great resistance to your stability. You can't stand in such a river. It takes you, it wants to take you with it. So all of these things in imaginations and experiences, their end or their perceived destination is to experience the river itself, but to never know the destiny of the river. of the nature of the flow of that water and of where it is going and how it gets there. And God has, in every sense, yes, he wants us to know of the river's beauty. He wants us to receive of the life that it can give. He wants us to be cleansed by its purity. And ultimately, he wants us to become one with its flow. And in that sense, then we ourselves become the beauty, the good flavor, have the cleansing nature, and the forceful flow of life. How? Not because we are our own, but because we have become part of the entire flow of the river. And we will inevitably take its course. We will magnificently bend every turn and flow around every hindrance and rock that is in the way, because it is the nature of the flow and force of that river to go around and over and above and through everything that comes in its face. It will inevitably reach its destination. It can't help it. It's its nature to fulfill the course that it has been put on. That's God's timing. That's the flow of God's life. You know, there's a scripture that says, there is a river that flows from the throne of God in the midst of the temple of God, and it brings gladness to the hearts of God's people. What really is this river? Jesus said, if you drink of this water, rivers of living water will spring from within you. Does the river itself need cleansing any longer? Does the river need to satiate its own thirst? Fulfill or seek out its own beauty? No, it is all fulfilling. That's the nature of God's life. That's the nature of the flow and the power of God's life and wisdom. You see, those things, maybe I'm not describing it well enough. It's another realm of life. It's another realm of fulfillment in time. It's perfectly aligned with a destiny fulfilled, even if it's not yet at its destination. James, in chapter 4, verse 13, I'll try and finish up. Chapter 4, verse 13 in James says, now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go do this to this or that city and spend a year there, carry on with business and make money. We know the times, the dates, the seasons, the plantings, the harvest. We can do such a thing because we have understanding and wisdom. We know how things work. Verse 14. Why? You don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? Speaking wisdom from Solomon, you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will. Now that's huge. Yeah, I used to be around a group of folks that were very careful to say whatever they wanted to say and follow it up with, if God wills. You know, because then we'd be obeying scripture, right? Come on. The recommendation for the heart and the perspective of the mind and the soul to say, if the Lord wills, means that we are fully immersed in the flow of God's will. Not that we need to spout out some kind of liturgy. If God wills, see you tomorrow. If God wills. If it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this and that. As it is, in this way of thinking, in this former way of thinking of giving our lives over to a particular life flow, time flow, you boast and brag, and all such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. Now, again, we are talking about being fully aligned with a particular flow of life. You know, when we, and I speak in some ways more specifically to the Lacasse family and to the Moon family, this teaching isn't for you, but I do want to bring some context into the value that we place on beginning to practice and understand God's timing. It's not just about celebrating events. I don't think that that's what any of you think. I hope it's not what any of us think. We are not practicing a replacement theology. Well, the world has its things, so we'll have our things. No. There's a living way. It's a change of the mind and the heart and the way that we look at our lives and the course of our lives. The way that we allow God to fulfill his will in us. That's the nature of the flow of that river. That's why Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are thirsty." There is a fulfillment that is an overflow. It becomes an abundance in you. And not for yourself. Overflow, by definition, means you can't contain it all. You then thereby become the source because you have been made to be one with the source. No independence, no singularity. There is a river. One God, one Father, one faith, one body, one head. This, to me, especially, and not to overly use a word or concept, this is a great display or to make a differentiation between the narratives of life. The world is on a track, in a sense, and so too are the people of God in a very different way. Which flow of life will we be found in? Well, I hope that is the joy of our heart to seek it out. You know, when one comes from the place of discovery, back to the illustration of the river, and takes that journey, there comes the point when you decide to become one with the river, that you have to leave everything else behind. You see, every other experience never leaves the world behind, never leaves the former life behind. Is this not the history, the testimony of Christianity through the ages? An experience with God? Yet the Messiah came and said, my life is not my own. It was hard for the disciples to understand. They themselves, like Peter said, you need to preserve your life. I'll help you preserve your life. Your life is meaningful. And Jesus said, he didn't argue anything in a sense. He said, my life is not my own. And it was because of that testimony that the Father gave the Son the power to both lay down his life and take it back up. Paul later said, it's the same power that raised Christ from the dead that is now in us. But are we yielding to that power? Have we become one with its flow? I mean, once you enter into that flow, you're going downstream at whatever pace that is already determined for you. If you've ever floated down a river, you know that there are points in that river that are narrow, fast, harsh, steep, treacherous. There are also parts of that river that are wide, still, and slow. There are obstacles and twists and turns. But they never stop, just like time. However, they will reach their destination from the high place to the low. That seems to be a reversal in our minds in terms of spiritual fulfillment. But the fulfillment is to be gathered into the sea of God's purpose. So that's it for my sharing. I hope it's an encouragement, maybe an exhortation a little bit, but an encouragement to be free and joyfully enter into the life flow and timing of God's fulfillment. It's really a liberation in one sense and a release in another, from none of these things should in our hearts or minds say anything about, a lack of responsibility in life, but rather a wisdom that should be applied in every decision that we make. And that, folks, will be the primary differentiation between God's people and the people of the world. It will be to them like a light shining in the darkness. How in the world is it possible that there are people who live in peace in such a time? When everyone else who is trying to govern time and make predictions for their lives and plans and protect, those things will come to their appointed end. Lord, give us wisdom in this way, Lord, and enable us by your grace, by the power of your Spirit, to put it to practice, and both to see the fruits and the benefits of it. You said that In that day, your people would be like a fruitful garden, like a well-planted tree, bearing fruit in due season, whose leaves would bring healing to the nations. It's a way of life that will bring healing, not just a word of testimony, a way of life. Lord, bless it.